Hi, everybody. It's Andy, and I am so proud of us for being so far ahead of our recording schedule. We recorded this weeks ago, and you're only hearing it now. But that does mean that I am forgetting to mention time-sensitive things on the actual episode. And this is the last episode that goes live before the pre-sale for the second version of the Cube Will Outlive Magic playmat ends. So the link is in the show notes if you want to get a version of that playmat. It's another pre-order. I don't know if or when there will be a version 3 or a third run, so make sure you pick it up if you want one through our friends at Stitcher's Supply. This is your last call. Do not email me next week and say, I missed the window, can I please have one now?
But your mics are so good.
Yeah, the mics
They
are okay.
look impressive.
They're actually like almost a decade old at this point. They used to be top of the line, but I don't know what they are now. I don't think they're made anymore. Either way, I think we can just get started with this episode of Lucky Pepper Radio in that case. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host Anthony, tippy top of the Cube Pyramid Scheme Maddox.
I got in early, I guess, and I'm here to make the big bucks when we cash out of Cube.
I guess technically I'm the tippy top because you were one of my 3 friends that I got to start investing in Cube.
This is how this happened, isn't it? Yeah,
it
okay.
is how it happened.
But no, LSV is the tippy top.
Yeah, I mean, certainly he's got to be the tippy top.
But of the
the
local Baltimore pyramid of Cube.
Yes, of the local Baltimore pyramid, I'm sitting right up there, right on your shoulders, and you're right underneath me. And I'm mentioning the Cube Pyramid Scheme because we got 2 special guests on this episode of the show. We are joined by Ethan, the middle of the Cube Pyramid Scheme Sachs, and Ben, the base of the Cube Pyramid Scheme Werney. Welcome, both of you, to the show. And Ben, I just got to say, all you got to do is get 3 friends now into Cube, and then you can no longer be the base. You can bring a new base in.
Amen. Sign me up. I'm in the pyramid scheme. Full hog.
I was thinking about how much to commit to like the sort of cult-esque nature of Cube into the intro, and I decided to go pretty soft on it with the pyramid scheme thing, but it really is the kind of thing.
You could go harder. I feel like one of the defining features of cults is having that core personality that kind of dictates the structure, right? And sort of keeps everybody, cults are,
You can see maybe why I didn't do this. As you start exploring the concept, it's a little bit distasteful, but really that is how Cube spreads, I think. I mean, this is a format that is a grassroots format that has some endorsement from Wizards, obviously with the official cubes on Magic Online, but I think when it comes to like designing your own cube, it always kind of spreads through like word of mouth pretty much. You find out from a friend, you get to play their cube, and you get hooked, and then you're in, and it sounds like maybe we, by virtue of Ethan, have hooked Ben.
I feel cube curious is how I would describe myself. Like I'm definitely whole hog in on the Lords of Limited Cube. And it's wild how quickly the floodgates opened. So I listened to your guest spot on our podcast. And around the same time, we had a Q&A episode, which was listeners submitting questions. And a couple of them were about like format design or cube or things like that. And somebody specifically was like, I wonder what a Lords of Limited Cube was like. And then that idea like started percolating in my head. And that took a few days. And then I was like, I'm just going to write down a few cards that I think would define the Lords of Limited Cube in a spreadsheet.
Yep, this is a very familiar story.
It started with like 15 cards. And as soon as I put those 15 cards in an Excel sheet, like the floodgates opened and I couldn't stop.
Yep.
The spreadsheet quickly had like 700 cards in it. And I was going through old stacks of cards, looking for paper cards. It was wild.
Andy is giving real like Darth Sidious vibes right now. He's like, yes, good. Let the cube flow through you.
No,
like,
it's more of just this story is just so familiar. Everybody who's designed a cube, it's sort of like, it just like sits there in the back of your mind and you have a few ideas. And then one day it's just like, what about? And then everything kind of comes out and like crystallizes all at once.
And then one day you're just trying to work at your job that you do to like participate in civil society, and you just can't because you just keep thinking of like, what about this card? Oh, and that card. And I forgot about this theme actually, kind of intersects with this theme. And then you're off to the races. So we're basically here to talk about the burgeoning Lords of Limited Cube, which I got to say, I am like so in love with the concept of this cube that you shared, and I would not say that if that wasn't true. I would just be like, yeah, let's talk about your cube. But I genuinely think it's such a sick idea. I mean, you've been doing your show since when? Was it Amonkhet you started the show?
Yeah, Hour of Devastation was the first set that we
The
did.
5-star restaurant rating review scale.
Why are you doing this? Why would you dox us like this?
Well, you've been doing the show for that long, and I think your concept, which I'll let you explain it in more detail, is basically like, let's make a cube about all the cards from the history of the Lords of Limited podcast, all the sets that you've talked about on the show and focused on and talked about how to draft successfully, which is such an awesome restriction for, a card pool that I think is really ripe for cube design. And then the idea of this becoming like a living artifact of the show almost, and like maybe as part of your like sunset episodes for sets, you like have a little segment where you talk about, and we're adding these cards to the cube. They're getting put into the sort of the archives for us to like keep playing with in our like own limited environment, is just such an awesome concept. So do you want to talk a little bit more about like what your idea for the cube is?
Yeah. So it's from HOU onwards. And I think, like you said, will be a living, breathing thing that we will keep adding cards to and rotating cards in and out of. The crux of the cube is a lot of our favorite build-arounds being the base or the core of the cube, and then the rest of the commons and uncommons being limited bangers that you would recognize from having played limited formats during the podcast's life that support a lot of those build-around-y type cards.
I think you said that you were basically making it mostly peasant with making a couple exceptions for, exciting build-around rares that feel like they fit the theme. And we're such big fans on this show of every aspect of your approach you've described so far, right? The idea that you're basically just starting with cards you like, cards you had fun playing with, and using that as the foundation. And then also, having a rough guideline for what you want it to be. I mean, obviously, Retail Limited is not, generally speaking, shaped by rares. It's shaped by the commons and uncommons of a given set. And so it makes sense to have the cube be mostly about that, but making exceptions, not like holding yourself really hard to that rule and saying, well, we can't include anything that has a gold set symbol because that's against the rules. Recognizing that sometimes that's actually totally fine to include something that has that's a rare if it fits the overall vibe that is established by the rule of thumb of mostly commons and uncommons.
The goal would be to get it to where Ethan and I love to draft it. And I think if we love to draft it, a lot of our listeners will love to draft it. And I think we love limited enough that it will probably be a good cube if we love to
for
draft
sure.
it.
But there are still like some, one of the reasons I'm very excited to have this opportunity is quite selfish, is just like, you guys have a ton of experience with this stuff. We don't. And so there are already sort of questions I had while we were going through this. And I think some probably common pitfalls that we have stumbled into or about to, or are perhaps avoiding, that I think will be fun to get to discuss. Certainly off the heels of, and I guess I don't know when this will come out, but off the heels of your most recent episode as of recording this, which was when you both came to, hey, how do we build around Genesis Wave? Which was like a very cool, like already someone in our Discord was like, oh, if you guys listened to that episode, I was like, yeah. And that was already sort of fascinating to hear your two different approaches there.
Well, and I do think we are suffering from, not suffering, that's not the right word, because I do think this should be a very collaborative experience, but we do have a bit of two cooks in the kitchen going on already. Like, we want this to be a both of us thing for the podcast. Often, like, when we're on a draft navigating together, Ethan wants to do one thing and I want to do another thing, and we end up with the worst deck overall.
Sure.
Because we're like half in each of our ideas, and I feel like we've hit that in a couple places in the cube already as well. It's probably not very common to have a co-designed cube, I would think. It's a very individual experience usually.
It's not unheard of, but it's rare. I know like a couple sort of team builds, but I think very common there'll be, somebody is the cube designer, they get the final say, it's their thing, but, they're playing with a consistent group that is offering a lot of insight and influence and just, experience with the cube. So definitely that community aspect is always important, I think.
There are definitely a couple cubes out there that are like famously moderated by multiple people. Like
that is the Pauper Cube is actually designed by committee.
All the Magic Online cubes that Daybreak Games runs, the Pauper Cube and Peasant Cubes both have like committees that like help make decisions about what goes into them. But on top of that too, the Chicago Cube is like run by, I want to say 3 or 4 people in Chicago that like all collaboratively manage that cube. I don't think it's rare because it's like fundamentally incompatible or like a difficult thing to do. I think it's just hard to find people of a similar investment level that, care about the thing the same amount. Your example of piloting a draft at the same time is, I think, a really good example, because that could be a mess, right? Because you have different proclivities and different biases in how you evaluate cards, and turns out that, the things that you think are good, Ben, are good alongside the other things you think are good. And as soon as you take the things you think are good and put them next to the stuff that Ethan thinks is good, neither of them are good anymore because they're not in the same context. But the thing that's beautiful about Cube is that there's inherently going to be multiple threads running through this cube, right? You are not building something as cohesive as a deck that only has one strategy and one sort of goal. There's going to be an interwoven web of multiple strategies, and I think you can think of each of you contributing different threads to this like beautiful tapestry that will become the cube, which is part of what makes cube design, I think, so much more dynamic and fun for me than like deck design, where deck design is like, yeah, you're going to like build the best deck you possibly can. You're going to be focused. There's like pretty hard rules to follow. And I think a lot of the questions you wrote down, Ethan, were like, all right, well, what are the rules for cube design? And it's like, well,
yes.
The thing is, there's not necessarily the same kind of rules, because at the end of the day, a lot of those rules come from the sort of rigorous optimization of trying to like meet an objective goal, which is winning a game of Magic. And you're going to get to put this cube in front of 8 drafters, and they will all then get to individually apply that rigor, but they're all in your garden. You're the ones that are setting the table, so you get to include whatever you want, and nothing you include is going to inherently break that competitive integrity, because it's, draft is self-balancing. Like, everyone is going to have their own autonomy at a draft seat. They get 45 decisions about what cards they take out of packs, and then they get their deck building portion. Like, there's so much of them in what they end up drafting that you really just get to kind of lay out a smorgasbord. And I think it's great to have 2 people laying out a smorgasbord with stuff they like.
So we've already done like a very small practice draft of this cube. So we had 7 people and a bot on Draftmancer, and then 4 people played out a couple games.
Mm-hmm.
And I played against a buddy of mine who we originally had the modules in from Kaladesh, the 3 modules, decoction module, fabrication module, the ones that make energy, put a +1/+1 counter on something, that cycle. And my buddy drafted those, and they really weren't good enough. And I was like, these aren't good enough compared to what I'm doing. We probably need to cut those and replace them with something else. I feel like we do have a responsibility, because ideally most people are going to draft this cube once, right? Or a couple of times. It's not like Ethan and I will be repeat drafters of it.
Sure.
But I do think we have some sort of a responsibility to try to provide a very good experience for, like, to not actively trap people. Like, I felt like having those modules in trapped that person, and then they didn't have a good experience as a result.
Yeah, that's fair. But I think that there's another question sort of in there that I think is really important to answer, which is, how is this cube actually going to get played? Like, who are going to be the players, and is it going to be mostly online, or are you going to build a paper version? Because that really does help you answer a lot of those questions when you actually have in mind who are the players that are going to be drafting.
Well, this pyramid scheme pilled person over here has already started cracking set boosters, pursuing paper copies of cards in this cube that is in its baby iteration. So I don't know, it may be in paper, but I think primarily we will probably keep it as a digital version and can draft it, in our Discord. People were talking about, it'd be fun to have like monthly cube nights and like have a cube champ. And we're lucky in that, we don't have an in-person community that we've cultivated like you guys, but we do have an online community that we've cultivated. And so we will have the opportunity to get this cube in people's hands in that way.
Yeah, and I think this like module example is a really nice little tidy case study, because you're right. Like, I think most cube designers would say they don't want to include cards that look really appealing in the pack, and then you get to games and it turns out that like actually this thing that looked appealing and powerful turns out is not appealing and powerful here. It's actually just kind of tricked me into thinking this was going to work. And, I think you all are, I've listened to some episodes of the show, and I know there's like varying relationships to the 17 lands data. And Ethan, as a longtime listener, you might know that like 17 lands, frankly, is one of the reasons we stopped playing retail limited. Like, it was just not fun for us anymore, when it was like we were going to the pre-release and we already had people that had like played a bunch online and like, made their pick orders and were like telling us that we built our serial pool wrong because of some 17 lands data. I'm like, what are we doing here?
Solving the problem, not just being handed a printout of here's the solution to the problem.
So then you must be very thrilled to know that 17 lands data will be coming to Vintage Cube very shortly.
Well, as you know, Ethan, we're very invested in Vintage Cube, so we're going to care a lot about that either way.
Those are like your 2 favorite things now colliding.
No, surely. I feel like so much of the Vintage Cube discourse is buoyed by the fact that there never were hard answers, and people got to argue all the time about like what they thought the best thing was. And I actually am curious to see if the existence of 17 lands data for a Vintage Cube is going to make all that discourse just way less fun for everybody, because it's like, actually we just know now that whatever is the best.
Which is fine. I mean, that's the great thing about Cube is we'll just build a new cube that we don't have the answers for, and we get to solve that difficult, interesting problem from scratch again.
Right. But I bring this up because you mentioned this module issue, and certainly I think, we've all had a play test where we can like very clearly see like, okay, these cards just don't work, right? Like whatever we thought they were going to do, they just don't do. And you feel like you don't need more examples before you're convinced that like they're not actually viable. But I will say, having designed so many cubes and drafted them with friends and seen so many players sit down and draft cubes, there are people that will sit down sometimes and just, you had some player that didn't work with the modules. It's entirely possible that like a different player would sit down tomorrow, draft that cube, and pop off with the modules, right? One draft example is like never going to give you the sort of whole picture. And so it's really not about like is this an objective trap? Is this, according to the time-traveling supercomputer, just a strategy that is never going to win? Because you will frankly never know that about any of the cards in your cube. It's more a question of like, what is your tolerance for variance? What is your tolerance for somebody taking a card that they think looks powerful that ends up not being powerful versus, how many times do the modules have to pop off each time they're drafted for it to be worth it? If they pop off 1 in every 5 times and like 20% of the time they like are really cool and powerful and exciting and make an awesome deck that otherwise wouldn't exist, is that worth the 4 times where they ride sideboards or end up in someone's main deck and actually don't do the thing they're supposed to do? And that's sort of the texture of, I think, all these conversations. And the right question to ask is not like, how do we rid this cube of all traps? How do we make sure that like every card does exactly what it promises and all the cards are like exactly equally powerful? I think it's more about like, given an individual card, what is the sort of relationship you want people to have to that and how often it has to be successful to be worth inclusion. I looked at all the notes you sent over, and the things I made the most notes on by far, and the question I thought was the most interesting to ask was like, here are cards we think we want to support, but we don't know how much support they need. And that is such a common cube question, and I think the modules kind of leads into that.
For me, everything you're talking about with the modules and that specifically, I think both Ethan and I are looking for like, play 23 cards, play 17 lands, and you're going to have a functional limited deck. Like, we want the cube version of that for limited.
Yeah.
Unless I'm wrong, Ethan.
No, I think that's right, but I think it sounds like we're going to be sorely disappointed if that's what we're asking for.
I don't think so. I mean, I think how much you want the cube to play like retail limited is a great barometer, because people often say that cube is kind of the combination or weird synthesis of constructed and limited, because you're drafting it, you're playing limited literally, but oftentimes, especially in powerful and vintage cubes, the decks you're drafting need to more closely resemble constructed decks with how focused their plan is and how much they can abuse build around cards. Like, a Reanimator deck is not a bread and butter limited deck, right? You have to like have very specific A-B combinations of cards to like make that happen. And it's good to know that you sort of envision being way further down that spectrum and much closer to just like retail limited, where, you're attacking and blocking, creature combat matters, and maybe synergies should not be ever so powerful that they overwhelm the sort of bread and butter fundamentals of draft a good curve, have some removal, and play creatures.
I think also to the idea of retail limited, one of the questions we have is regarding power level and power outliers, and just like how we might expect that to play out in terms of, you mentioned and mentioned because I mentioned that we're keeping it kind of peasant-ish as sort of like maybe a tiebreaker for things. We're not opposed to rares being in there, but we are opposed, I think, to rares, or I'll speak for myself. I'm opposed to rares in there for like rare's sake. If a rare is going to be in there, I would like it to have some kind of meaning for us in terms of its prevalence on the podcast. One of the things that we both really like a lot is the 10 companions from Ikoria. Not all of them are in this cube, but companion is a mechanic we like a lot. And so we are, I think, currently half of the companions are in this cube because we like them. And I think successfully companioning those is going to happen. I mean, again, don't want to draw too much conclusions from the one full pod practice draft we did, but in that pod, I think half the people companioned. Is that true, Ben? Am I remembering that right?
There were several.
So 4 of the 8 drafters companioned, which we're okay with that. We're thumbs up. We like that. We like that the companions are some of the more powerful things to do in the cube, and that people will be incentivized to try and meet their restrictions. I think that's good. But balancing that, I think, is kind of tough in terms of like, I feel like I was trying to take an axe to some rares that Ben had put on the list, because I was like, when it's a rare, we should cut it. And I think, Ben, you feel differently.
Not that I feel differently necessarily. I don't feel super strongly about this one. It was more a question I had for you guys, in that if I'm somebody who's sitting down, and I guess I'm just using me as an example here, but if I'm sitting down to draft whatever, I heard you guys talking about the Fire Swamp cube or whatever for the first time. I've gone back and binged like 20 of your episodes, so already been a very successful crossover.
Well, somewhere you just made Brett's day for mentioning the Fire Swamp. So
this was a very direct marketing to get one new listener, and it worked.
Pyramid scheme's going strong. I want to, when I sit down and open a pack, I want to find a card in that first pack that looks better than the others, so I can feel confident about, okay, I picked the best card out of this pack. Now let me try to do this thing that this card asked me to do. And I feel like our cube, outside of the companions and some cute build around rares like Cursed Recording that wants you to have spells or things like that, there aren't a ton of cards that point you in a direction. And I think Ethan and I are different that way, where Ethan really likes to open a pack, decide what card he wants, and decide what thing he wants to do. Like, he wants to have agency over what he decides to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I very much prefer being pushed in a direction based on the power level of a card and then doing that thing. Like, I don't want to have to make the decision. I want to feel like the pack makes it for me.
And I think you'll naturally land somewhere in between. But I would actually point back to sort of what you said about your expectations about who's playing it. And if you expect people to often be playing this for the first time, this is their one draft, I think you can actually tolerate a pretty wide power band and some outliers, because where those can be problematic in my experience is just if you're having the same group of people playing the same cube over and over again, then it's like, oh, you had the Garuda deck again. Like, I lost to this last draft and I'm losing to it again. That can get a little bit tired. But if you're having people that are drafting it for the first time, having something that's splashy in a pack that can pull them in a direction can definitely be part of the fun. And I've definitely had the experience of having cubes where it's like really a flat power level and having that pack that's like, I guess I could just kind of take everything, and that is fun for some people, but not necessarily for everybody.
So many people come to Cube and what their attitude is like, I'm so excited to draft with no bad cards, right? I just want all the cards to be the same power level and every strategy to be exactly equally powerful. And I think people are very quickly disabused of the joy from that, because it actually is, at the end of the day, if you literally just have a cube where like all the cards are exactly equally powerful, you put them in the supercomputer and they're just like, yep, these are all 50% win rate. It's like, okay, well, now my decisions literally don't matter. Like, sure, I can pick what color I'm playing, but like, I'm not actually like using my card evaluation skills or whatever to like try and figure out what that open lane is. And so I think that, yeah, like Anthony said, you're going to end up somewhere in between. And the reality of so many cubes, I think, is that they can offer different things to different drafters. And I think the right cube, Ethan, you would open a pack and you would say like, well, there's 6 different things that are all viable here, and I get to choose which one I want to do today, or which one I think, suits me as a player or whatever. And, Ben, you could open that same pack and be like, well, clearly this is the card that I'm supposed to be playing with, right? And it's not impossible to have an environment where you've crafted it in such a way that you both have that experience, and that disagreement is almost what you should be trying to cultivate with the cards you're including. Like, you should be aiming for packs where you both feel differently about it. That's when you know the cube is in a good place and not some weird kind of solved problem.
I like that. But how? Teach us.
And the cube is also not necessarily a static thing. It's not like you're designing a limited set, which you have to send to print, and then whatever it is going to be played thousands and thousands of times. You have the chance to change it with every single draft that you do. So if you do play it 3 times and you're like, okay, well, the third time that half of the pod was companions, we've had enough of that. Then you just change it. So it's like, it's very low stakes in a lot of ways. So I don't know. That's not a concrete answer. It's just like, don't worry about it. It's fine. Do whatever you want.
My notes on power outliers are more sparse, because ultimately what it comes down to with powerful cards that are better than everything else in the pack is like, just play the ones that you think are fun, or in this case, have like a specific tie into like the history and story of Lords of Limited, right? It's really as simple as that, right? The power outliers are going to shape a lot of games. They're going to shape a lot of decks. They're going to shape a lot of drafts. And so just make sure that people are shaping their games and decks and drafts around cards that are creating the kinds of games and decks and drafts you think are fun. And I forget the name of the artifact that's basically double vision that you mentioned, Ben, and also talked about on the recent episode of Lords of Limited, the one that copies spells. That to me is a great example of a card that I am so happy to have shape someone's deck and drafting games, because it's just enhancing other cards you've already drafted, right? It's not like you play it and then it just does its thing regardless of what else is in your deck or regardless of what your opponent is doing. Now you play it and it depends on what else you drafted and what you're going to cast and get to copy with it that shapes the texture of how that card plays. Compare that to something like, just a lot of interchangeable giant, 5 and 6 drops that are like super powerful, right? Like a Glorybringer or an Elder Gargaroth or whatever. And it's like, okay, you play that card and it doesn't really matter what else is in your deck. It's just like, does your opponent have removal? If not, the game is over, right? And the cards that you play and then the game is kind of just over, to me, are not that fun because you didn't get to play with it. You just played it and then your opponent scooped, right? It's like you didn't actually get to play with the card and like play many turns with it. You just resolved it and then your opponent couldn't beat it, which it doesn't matter what the rules text is at that point. It could just say you win the game if you untap, and that's not all that fun. So really the power level stuff is like is about that. And the other thing I would say to keep in mind is just there is a distinction between like relative and absolute power level. There are plenty of cards that are in the vintage cube that are, among Magic's most powerful cards of all time that I think would be totally fine here if you wanted to include them. I mean, obviously they wouldn't fit your restrictions, but like if you wanted to play Ponder, you could play Ponder. Like, it's a huge problem. It's like banned and limited, and like you can't play it in Constructed for a lot of reasons, but it is so trivial in terms of what it does to the game. It's a little one-mana impact, and it gives you some card selection, and it makes the game smoother. And yes, in the aggregate, when you're playing Constructed or whatever, that can cause a huge problem. So it is one of Magic's most powerful cantrips. But in terms of absolute power level, it's not like you cast Ponder and then your opponent's like, well, now I can't win. You know, it's not like you played Minsk and Boo or, you know, whatever, that is just some unbeatable threat. And so power level, I think you can always look at a card that is really powerful and say, is this relatively powerful or is it absolutely powerful? And if it's relatively powerful, I think there's a lot more leeway for running, you know, relatively powerful power outliers rather than ones that are just absolutely powerful, that just their game impact is massive for what you're paying for them.
I have a more specific question for you. Going back to what types of cards we include or how supported cards are, and you were talking about a card that, you know, maybe only gets drafted 25% of the time, but when it does, it's pretty cool, that sort of thing. I feel like, again, Ethan and I have slightly different goals in that perspective, in that, and this is me putting words in your mouth, but my impression from, like, because we've changed the list several times. Like, I made a list, and then Ethan...
I want to peel back the curtain just slightly, because
you know there's a history tab on Cube Cobra. You say you've changed it several times. We know exactly how... Oh, it's a lot.
Well, Ben... it started with Ben sending me a Google sheet of like 800, 900 cards that he was like, these are cards that this was the floodgates.
This is the way. This is the way.
Yeah, this is the way. But so then I was tasked with trying to turn it into something functional. So I was like trying to take a scythe to it. And every card, of course, Ben was like, no, but that goes with, and that can do this. And so, but I was like, we just need to get this to a list of 540 so we can then... Like, we don't know what we like want or don't want until we have something to work with. So that's why there's this also massive maybe board on Cube Cobra now with that thing, because those are all the cards that have, you know, gone in and out or whatever. But so that's it. Is I feel like my role primarily has been like mean dad to the cube.
Yeah. Well, and I think a necessary role. I appreciate what you've done. I don't want it to come across that way.
Thank you for coming in and killing all of my children.
Yeah.
We got to 540, and thank you for doing that. But since we got to 540, we've made swaps. And that's where I feel like we've had different goals. And you and I haven't had this conversation yet. But I feel like your mentality is closer to wanting to make it to where people have similar-ish decks, or not, that's not right, but that there are supported archetypes. Like, we have made archetypes, and the archetypes are supported. And I think my view and or vision was, let's sprinkle all these things in and a bunch of cool cards that do a bunch of different things and see what people can come up with. And if they don't always come together, that's fine. Like, I feel like, so just a specific example of this is Drakehaven. I think that is in the cube and like works, right? I feel like you think we have to have Drakehaven as a supported archetype. And I just don't feel that way about it. And I just will cede the floor to you to say how you actually feel instead of me putting words in your mouth.
I think Drakehaven is an excellent example. There's a couple cards that, like, after I did my big hacking away and, you know, cut a bunch of gold cards, whatever, you had a short list in our spreadsheet of Ben's wish list of cards he'd like to get back in. And two of those cards were Emery, Lurker of the Lock, and Gearseeker Serpent. And I am reticent to put those cards in because I don't believe that there's a massive artifact support there. I think your assessment, Ben, of my feeling is correct. That, like, I am feeling a kind of like, I don't feel like artifacts is really supported, and so I don't want to put those cards in. But there was sort of a, oh gosh, what is the phrase I'm looking for? Where, like, you manifest the thing that you're worried about. Like, I was going through and seeing like Drakehaven, and I was like, it's not really supported. And so then every card that did kind of support it, I was like, well, we can cut that because this isn't really supported, you know? Like,
I believe self-fulfilling prophecy is what you're looking for.
That's what I was looking for. Yes, I was fulfilling the prophecy of like cutting the cards that supported Drakehaven, and so I think even currently it is less supported than it might be. But I agree. I am overall worried. Like, I saw Fiery Temper in there, and I'm like, there's not a lot of ways to discard cards. We can cut Fiery Temper, whatever.
But how good is 1 RR 3 damage to any target? Probably pretty good.
It's fine.
It's fine. Yeah. Not embarrassing, but not great. No. But that's the thing I think is fun to incentivize, is that whoever can make use of it is going to get it late, and they'll be like, oh, sick, Fiery Temper. That goes great in my deck.
I guess I would just like, I probably need reps or whatever, but also maybe some expert guidance of like, I don't know how much we have to seed in support for cards like that versus just putting them in there. Like Dovin's Acuity, the 1 white blue gain 2 draw card and then pick it up when you cast an instant in your main phase. Like that is that's going to be in the cube. That is a very important card to us. But I was like arguing like, well, do we need to like support it? And Ben was like, there's going to be instants in the cube and people can play them at sorcery speed and like it'll be fine. That's an example of a place where I'm like, can we just put this card in and say, there it is? Because I wonder if I'm drafting the cube and I open and I see pack one, pick one, Dovin's Acuity, I'd be like, oh, sick. This is going to be like a deck. And maybe it is, but I don't know if it is as much as like, I know there's like Rakdos Sacrifice and Mardu tokens and stuff in this cube and blue-red spells because of Cursed Recording. I don't know how much I know that about a card like Dovin's Acuity. And I guess also I have a larger question of like, does that matter?
I mean, I think the examples of Emery and Gear Seeker Serpent are really great examples to the question of like how much support do they need. And I think that we're in a great position with you guys being expert limited players to be able to leverage that skill and answer those questions in a pretty concrete way. Emery, I feel like you can get away with a pretty low density of artifacts. You just really need one thing that you're like happy recasting every turn, right? As a limited player, given kind of the rate that you've set in this cube, how many artifacts do you want in your deck that are sort of like these trinkety value engine type artifacts to make Emery like fit that rate, to like fall above that line to be something you're happy to put in your deck? And I think that's going to be very different for Gear Seeker Serpent with Affinity, where you just want a ton. But then we can kind of extrapolate from that. If you're like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like if you say I want 5 little trinkety artifacts before Emery is good, then say triple that in your 540 cube, so we will end up with a little bit, because other people are going to take them, then that's a place that it kind of feels about right to me. So like, yeah, like how many artifacts do you want for your Emery deck to be good?
Can we dial in on like
where did you pull 5 and where did you pull X3
well, where did you pull X3 from? Like that's the kind of thing I think we are looking for, and you just like rattled that off like, yeah, of course everybody knows that you should triple this.
Sure. Okay, so like
unfortunately he made it up.
I just made it up, yeah. Back of the napkin math, like let's imagine we were at a 360 cube. You want to say like, okay, I want X number of a particular effect in this deck for it to be functional. And then I know I'm only going to see about 75% of the cards during a draft. That is a real number, I think. And plus, other people are going to incidentally like, oh yeah, here's a random artifact that's just going to be good for somebody else because it's a removal spell. So
I think you see substantially more than 75% of the cards in a given draft.
Be true.
I think you see 92 per pack, which is 300 and almost 300 of the 360 card in the given set. Doesn't matter. You see a lot of the cube in the draft, and so it's a question of like, God, this is why it's also complicated and beautiful. Honestly, I have so many notes about each of these examples. Every single one of these cards, I have so many notes about. And we can just start with Emery, right? Like Emery, I think Anthony's right. I think one way you could think about supporting Emery is like, I want an artifact that can self-sacrifice for value. Therefore, I can cast it every single turn with Emery. And I don't think you need very many of those in your deck before you're happy with Emery, because Emery mills over a bunch of cards. So Emery is going to, by virtue of the cards you've already drawn and by virtue of milling over, be pretty good at finding one of those sort of trinkety cards in your deck. So if you have a Aether Spell Bomb or a Pyrite Spell Bomb or, whatever, then you'll have a pretty good chance of finding it with Emery. Another way to think about supporting Emery is not having self-sacrificing artifacts you can cast repeatedly, but just enough artifacts that you can just cast a couple things out of the graveyard with Emery. And then we get to this like question of limited, right? Like, how many spells do I need to cast off of Emery that are just like an artifact creature, a Phyrexian Revoker or whatever, before I'm happy with the rate that I paid for that card, right? And that answer is relative to what you expect the sort of power level of the cube to be. In that regard, I think Gear Seeker Serpent is actually much more simple. It's like, at what mana value are you happy to be playing Gear Seeker Serpent? How does it compare to the 4 drops and the 5 drops and the 6 drops in the cube versus the 2 drops and the 3 drops? I see your finger up, Ethan.
Not to dial in too much on Emery specifically, but I do think that there's an aspect of Emery that we're glossing over, which is that I don't want to cast a 3-mana 1/2.
That's why you need to be casting stuff out of the graveyard, yeah.
No, what I'm saying is like, I think for me, and I don't know if Ben feels differently, but for me, I need to have a density of artifacts in my deck so that Emery doesn't cost 3 when I cast it.
Right, you're saying you want it to be cheaper specifically.
I don't think that a 3-mana 1/2 is an appropriate limited card to be playing. And so it's more than just getting the value. I need artifacts in play when I cast this so that it's cheaper.
We just haven't talked about this cube that much because
cube therapy.
I was on fall break and just vomited all this stuff. A lot of it was putting it together, but we haven't conversed about much what we want the cube to do. And I think this is another place where we're philosophically different maybe about what we see for this or the vision. I will be happy as a clam losing while I'm casting Emery and like doing some artifact stuff. And if I lose because Emery's a 3-mana 1/2, that doesn't bother me because I'm going to be happy because I'm playing with Emery.
And here's what I'll say too, Ethan, is like, okay, 3-mana 1/2, obviously not good and limited. If you get to untap and cast a spell, 3-mana 1/2 that drew you a card with a little bit of selection, you get to untap and cast a 4-drop artifact creature. Okay, how good is 3-mana 1/2 draws you a 4-drop artifact creature you get to play next turn? Is that on rate for this environment?
Yes, I would say. Yeah, I mean, because we're playing a bunch of like 3-mana 2/1 cantrips. So yeah, I
noticed that. Yeah, so like it's not that far off from that sort of space. And then obviously, if you get to do it a second time, and now you've cast 2 spells and drawn 2 cards off your Emery, like you can see how even at 3 mana, this can be a huge card advantage engine that can just snowball. And then that sort of touches on a bunch of other questions of like, how much removal do you have for 2 toughness creatures? And am I going to play a 3-mana 1/2 and have it mill over a bunch of cards and then you just remove it? And then you can say, okay, well, now I went 1 for 1 on cards. And so like, what was the cost of that removal spell? Was it a 1-mana removal spell, in which case I feel pretty bad for paying 3 mana for your 1-mana spell and being even on cards? Or was it an O-ring, in which case I feel fine. We both paid 3 mana. We both played a spell. We're both down a card. This is where like this beautiful, I get so like romantic about the beauty of cube design because of how it like touches on all these different aspects.
So how are we feeling? Are we getting Emery in the list? I think this is the real question that I have because I also want to be casting it.
Here's the thing. Based on this conversation, I think it is so sick for there to be a card in the cube, Ethan, that you think is not that good and you never play it and you just sometimes get smoked by it. I think that is like the perfect spot for a card like that to be. Like you don't have to, you as Ethan, the spiky limited grinder, look at every single card in this list and think like, yes, this is a like perfectly viable card. And I can tell you from experience, I have had cards in my cube that I'm like, this card is bad. I shouldn't be here. Like, it's kind of not that great. And then I get absolutely smoked by somebody playing it against me. And I'm like, well, I guess I suck. Like, it's Magic is a game of variance. Like, someone will sit down and pack one, pick one Emery, and they will end up with way more artifacts than you would expect they would get because they will be taking dumb little artifact trinkets over like what you would consider to be much better generically good cards that you're like, well, no, you should take the generically good card here. Why are you taking this trinkety artifact? And it's because they pack one, pick one Emery and they're hard committing to this synergy. And then they'll make it work in ways that you think are bad and shouldn't work or like, you know, represent some sort of lack of discipline as a drafter. And to me, like the beauty of Cube is that like it is partially what you give people and partially what they as drafters bring to the table. I'm thinking of like specific players in our play group. We have one player, our friend Daniel, who's been on the show before, who is primarily a commander player and does not like limited that much, does not consider himself a spiky player. And he will sit down at someone's cube. And yeah, I'm not going to lie. 2 out of 3 times, Daniel absolutely train wrecks. He like sees some card and takes it and he like just ends up with a pile. And you're like, okay, this is a deck that somebody that only really plays Commander and, you know, doesn't think of themselves as a competitive player. This is a deck they would end up with.
I'm drafting Dragon Tribal, and you're like, there's nothing even close to that in this cube. And he's like, well, I'm 5 colors, and that's a dragon, and that's a changeling, and so this is fine.
But then 1 out of 3 times, genuinely, Daniel will have a deck where it's like the coolest, weirdest, sickest deck you've ever seen, and he'll just run the table with it. And you're like, I didn't even know that was possible. And that experience of, as the cube designer, someone drafting a deck where you're like, I didn't even think that was viable. I would never have thought to put those cards together. In my mind, they don't go together. And yet you've done it is, I think, one of the most beautiful things about the format. And so the fact that you, Ethan, are looking at cards and saying, I don't think that's good or viable, I don't think that's a reason to cut a card. I think that's a reason to maybe just celebrate the differences in you two as drafters and allow both to exist, right? I don't think you should open a pack, Ethan, and say, none of these cards are good. These are all Emerys and Gear Seeker Serpents and like really committal cards that like I can't, as my sort of, you know, draft proclivities, I can't express my like values here because none of these cards are cards I want to pick. I don't think you're near that, though. I think you're seeing a couple cards in packs. You're like, I don't want to pick that card. We should cut it. And it's like, let someone else pick it. Let someone else pick it and then go beat them, Ethan. Prove yourself right.
Well, I think it's about me having the knowledge of the full cube list in that, like, I'm not opposed to first picking Gear Seeker Serpent or Emery out of a pack of some cube. But in my head, I don't think, like, I feel like it's kind of a trap akin to the modules that, like, if someone sits down and opens a pack of this cube and sees Emery, I think that tells them this is supported. That's what I would interpret. I would say this is supported.
So you're worried about tricking, and Ethan in a parallel universe that doesn't know the cube list and sees Emery and thinks, well, there must be 150 artifacts in this cube because that's the only situation that I would put Emery in a cube.
Correct. Yeah.
That dials in on the fundamental philosophical difference between us. I think that's where I'm saying I feel like you want to have 10 supported archetypes, and I'd like to have like 70 archetypes or whatever.
But I'm not worried about, like, I am much less, someone in our Discord was like, what are the, like, do you guys have the archetypes? And I am not really thinking about this cube in that way, like that blue-white is this and red-black is this, because I would like them to sort of contain multitudes. And I really like took y'all's advice to heart of like, less gold cards, because it is so easy to jam a cube with gold cards. But I think that can also, in my very brief cube design of yore, that I feel like hamstrings you a little bit when you're just trying to be like blue white is this and red black is this and your draft is on training wheels and go forth. Like, that's not fun, and that's not what we want to do.
And I think also is kind of unattainable. Like, if you try and do those really strict archetypes, yeah, you don't have the like design manpower that Wizards of the Coast has, so that's gonna fail. And so people are gonna just, I think thinking about it from a player perspective, what I said on our episode of your podcast was be skeptical. Like, you see Emery, don't just think that's a thing that you can latch onto and make your entire deck about that. Be willing to adapt. If you see the first 3 packs and you're like, I didn't see a lot of artifacts, maybe this is not as supported as I thought it was. And I think that sort of cultivating your draft culture such that people come into a draft with some skepticism and don't necessarily fall into what might turn out to be traps is pretty important.
Which really touches on what is actually the most important thing, which is kind of a meta thing that's maybe not that interesting to talk about, which is just setting expectations, right? Like, Anthony's regular cube, I think, is a great example of the kind of cube design that you're talking about, Ben, where like Anthony's like, I don't want there to be just a like small finite number of like supported things that are like really well supported. I want there to be a sprinkling of 30 to 40 different like decks you can possibly draft here, and you're going to combine a little bit of an artifact package with a little bit of a discard package with a little bit of a delirium package, and like you're not drafting any one of those decks. There's not enough for there to be an artifact deck or a discard deck or a delirium deck. There's just, you can combine these things in kind of weird ways. That's something you say. Like, when you are like sitting down to draft the cube, you're like, hey, this is a cube that's all about, basically master set power level, and if you see a card like, what's the Steel Overseer? You see a card like Steel Overseer, don't think that every single one of your creatures is going to be an artifact. Think, hey, a 2-mana 1/1 that grows every single turn and also maybe grows one other thing is actually fine here. Like, that's actually the kind of rate you're looking for. And
yeah, so, maybe another example, I have Archfiend of Ifnir in that cube, and deliberately there's not a ton of discard because that would be very, very strong. So I've sort of deliberately tuned that down a little bit. But then you end up casting that card and you're like, oh, actually just a 5-mana 5/4 flyer is pretty good here. So people, maybe they kind of fall into a trap, but then it ends up being fine.
Which is only to say that, like, ultimately, as long as you're setting expectations, which I am glad that you're both kind of, no shade on anybody that wants to design a cube this way. I know a lot of our listeners do, where you kind of pick out your 10 archetypes for your color pairs, which is how Wizards of the Coast has designed every limited format for the past 10 years, and it works really well for retail limited because that's a format where a lot of players need a sort of obvious sign. They need a signpost. They need something to tell them what to do because they are making an environment that's meant to be drafted by players of vastly different skill and investment in the game. And so having that is really helpful. I don't like it as much for Cube for all the reasons we've talked about. And I think that just thinking about setting expectations so you don't give people a like list of 10 archetypes at the beginning of the draft and say, here's what you're supposed to be doing if you're in these color pairs. And instead just say like, yeah, this is a cube that has a like little taste of all the things that all the sets that Lords of Limited has ever talked about, references. So don't expect to be able to draft like any sort of committed deck from any of these sets because there's not enough cards from any set to like make that something you can do, and instead expect to be combining cards that otherwise were never played together alongside each other to kind of make your own new strategy.
The issue with that, though, is that like some of the archetypes, if we just do greatest hits, which I think is initially what my giant Excel spreadsheet was just like, these are cool cards from all of the limited
joy.
sets. Yeah, cards that was very what is it?
Marie Kondo.
Yeah, Marie Kondo.
We literally have an episode called Cards We Think Are Cool. So yes, we know how that goes.
If we just do that and we do a smattering, then archetypes are going to be juiced. Like blue-red, because blue-red so consistently spells that you are going to be able to make a very hyper-focused spells. And I guess we could tune it down. Like I just recently added Gandalf's Sanction. I am looking through my collection and just pulling cards for a paper version of this cube because I have Draft Chaff from forever. It's the Lord of the Rings 1 blue-red that does X to a creature and excess damage goes to the creature's controller. That's going to be really good in the blue-red deck. It's going to be really good in the blue-red deck. there is sort of a balancing act in that, like, Ethan was right. Like, I initially had energy stuff in there, and I initially had what was the other thing we cut? Ring tempting, like some ring tempting, some energy.
We also had a few start your engines we really loved from Ether Drift, but like it's just one of the reasons it is good as a limited mechanic is once you have a redundancy of it, it's just good because you're gonna consistently be starting your engines, and then you'll know that you can get it up to 4. Doesn't work when like there's 5 cards in a 540 cube.
That is going to be something you're going to have to contend with, and as cube designers, we often will see a new mechanic and be like, well, this is probably not one for us unless we want to commit whole hog to it. And so the nature of, start your engines or the ring tempsy was like, you need a density of this for it to work. And so even though you might really like this card from that limited set, or, it might, otherwise make sense, given that it does have a mechanic that is like very insular, that might just not make sense in a like limited drafted sense. Whereas, the idea of like blue-red spells always being a thing, right? That's like one of the themes of blue-red and like almost every set the Wizards puts out. I don't think that's inherently a problem, right? I think it's okay that, you have an abundance of support for blue-red spells and a little bit of support for blue artifacts and a little bit of support for green +1/+1 counters or whatever the sort of other themes are. I don't think they have to be in equal parts, because the reality is that if blue-red spells is like massively oversupported, let's just pretend you had like, twice as many blue-red cards as like any other color combination, and you like had all the best payoffs, you're going to have 2 to 2.5 drafters in it every single time, right? It's not like somebody's just going to get absolutely fed the juice blue-red deck and somebody else is going to be like, well, I just drafted blue artifacts and I don't have as many cards as you do. Your drafters have autonomy and they have accountability for their picks. And so it's like, you shouldn't be playing blue-red and passing the blue-red spell stuff because you think you're blue-red artifacts. You should be, taking the best card and trying to like draft the best deck at your seat, which I think is just something that we've seen play out a bunch, is that like, I think it's very common for cube designers to be very worried about the balance of these things before they play the cube. And then when they play it, mostly the experience actually is like, oh, this actually kind of just works, right? And you may have the occasional, module experience you had, Ben, where it's like, oh, I like these cards, but they didn't really do the thing I wanted them to do here. That'll happen. And then you just kind of live and learn. But I actually think that maybe much to Ethan's chagrin, it's very hard to, with abstract theory, get this all right. And instead it's like, make your best 80% shot and then play it a bunch and see how people feel and see what kind of feedback you get. Because the other thing about cube design is ultimately, because we're not drafting any of these cubes in the sort of numbers that the data is going to be statistically significant and matter, you're not actually even trying to figure out what really is the best archetype or really is a trap. You're just trying to figure out what feels like a trap or feels like the best archetype, And it might be that people's feelings actually trump the, results. If you play the cube a bunch and people just feel like, turns out that there is only ever one blue-red spell drafted for some reason, and we don't know why, but that deck always just absolutely smashes everybody, then you might have to like turn it back. But I would expect that you would see more people in that archetype if it is a thing that is more supported.
Well, but you were talking about it being more supported, like to go back to the Fire Swamp cube. That cube is what? But what I gathered, I've never seen it, but primarily red and black, but there's still cards of every color in it, yeah? That's what you were describing?
Yeah, it's mostly black, and there's like a fair number of colors in red and green, and then there's like 2 blue or white cards just kind of sneaking around there.
You can also only add basic mountains, so if you want other colors, you got to draft them.
We did try to balance, and I think but Ethan's done a darn good job of that, of like numbers of cards in each color, like 50-ish multicolored cards, 35 artifacts, colorless cards, whatever. Blue-red's not disproportionately represented in terms of numbers of cards.
Yeah, not quantity, but quality.
Yeah, quality, I think, is the issue. But I don't think that is where we need help. Like, I think you and I are going to be really good at tuning a limited environment. Like, because we're going to have people to play it. We're going to be able to draft it. We'll dial it back. Like, those kinds of problems, I feel confident we can solve.
Or at least have a really fun argument about. Here's a question for starting out. Is that so much of this cube design is going down memory lane and going, ooh, I like that card. Ooh, I remember that card. Ooh, I had fun with that card, and putting them in and trying to support them. None of those cards that we go, ooh, I like that card, are removal spells. And I think that this is probably a pretty common pitfall that early cube design comes to, which is like, you want to do stuff where people are assembling their thing and that is supported. But inherently, you need disruption, and we definitely want that because we want it to play out close to retail limited, because that's our experience. That's where our home is. Are there heuristics for that? Because I think we even got from our one practice draft, we got a piece of feedback like, hey, it felt like interaction was a little light. And that was already something I was keyed into because I think that's just a normal place to end up in at the beginning with like, these things were fun and none of the fun things are kill spells.
This is, I think, a really deep topic that we can definitely touch on. I'll refer you both. We have at least 4 episodes basically entirely about this, about density of removal, the nature of that removal, the nature of your threats and how they line up against your removal. And none of those episodes are comprehensive because it is such a deep topic. But the first thing I'll say is that, and I have not played Retail Limited in any serious way for years and years and years, but my initial impression and like sort of understanding of Retail Limited is that removal is a lot more limited than in the average cube environment. Like you're usually playing a deck that kind of is mostly expecting to like trade in combat, and then maybe you have 3 to 5 interactive spells that are going to allow you to like remove their one big problem thing. But I don't have the impression that in most Retail Limited sets you are able to draft a deck that is like hard control in the fact that it is just trying to remove all of its opponent's threats all the time and then, you know, resolve one threat on turn 9 and like win the game off the back of that. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but let's just start there. What is your impression of like how dense removal should be in what you're sort of imagining as a like limited style deck?
I would hope that decks would be able to pick up 3 to 5 pieces of interaction on average, and then maybe there to be an archetype like Blue Red Spells or Grixis Control that does get a much higher density and does try to play a true control game. Like, for example, if I had to use this card as an example, again, Cursed Recording, if I draft that 2-red artifact that doubles my spells, I'm going to want 7 to 10 removal spells in my deck so that I can, you know, double them and control the board.
That is one of the things that it's actually quite easy to scale up, right? Like if you know I want the average deck to have 3 to 5 and I want a couple decks per pod to have 7 to 10, you can just add those numbers up and multiply by 8, and then, you know, that gives you your sort of pool, right? Like, add them all together, and then just that's how many you're going to want to have roughly in the cube. Then you have the question of like rate, because you can also, as I'm sure you're aware, put cards in the cube meant to fill some role and have people just never play them. Just be like, oh, actually, I don't think that card's good enough. And so even though it is a removal spell, I'm not putting it in my deck. So it doesn't actually count towards the removal spells that are going in people's decks because I'm not actually playing it, which is a whole other sort of can of worms. I wish I could give you something, Ethan, here that was like a better rule of thumb for this, other than it really comes down to like the texture of games you want. And if you want decks to have 3 to 5 pieces of removal on average and then 7 to 10 sometimes, like you can just multiply that, scale it up to like the cube size, and then just make that, generally speaking, the density you have, and then see how it plays out. I do think it's worth thinking about in the abstract beyond just adding cards you like. Because like you said, Ethan, it is very easy to end up adding cards you like and have a sort of a connection to not end up with a bunch of like bread and butter removal spells. But you do want to create an environment where those are things that are present. So you might find yourself carrying a card you really like for another forgettable Doomblade or O-Ring or, you know, Shock or whatever. But I do think that having a density of those that is what you would expect decks to end up with is an important step, just making sure the decks play the way you want them to play.
So the math is, let's say we want every deck to have 5. Can we go over the math? Because I'm a band teacher. I only do music.
Yeah, I mean, if you want decks to have 5, I think you should basically plan on like 6 to 7 per pool, and that's just for cards that are off color, early picks that were speculative that, you know, you didn't end up playing that color, or you just get something late that, you know, you can't play in your colors. Like, make that 6 to 7, and then you just say, all right, well, 6 to 7 times 8 is a number.
And then 1.5, yeah, so about 70, yeah.
Yeah, so then you got to do the 1.5 thing to get you up to 540. So yeah, you want like 70-ish removal spells basically in the cube. And obviously there's so much texture to that, right? Like 70 removal spells, how many of them are like little tiny disfigures and shocks versus like, you know, a murder or something like that? And that's a whole other question to answer. And how many of them are in red and black versus, you know, getting some into white and green? Like that's another question to answer. But I think that basic number of just starting at like roughly 70 would probably basically fit that goal that you're describing.
And you being an experienced limited player that can answer that very concrete question of like how many do you expect to see in a deck actually makes this much easier than for a lot of players who just don't necessarily have a sense for that. So I think we can go with a lot of confidence with that like about 70, 75 number.
That's very helpful.
That's extremely helpful. And so we could just do the same thing then for creatures and for combat tricks or whatever. We can run that same math to try to get the cube balanced. Like that's extremely helpful information.
Yeah, and I think another place where that math ends up being helpful for people is that if I find early cube designers often have a much higher curve than they actually end up with. Like they start with a higher curve, and as they edit their cube over time, they just keep making the curve lower and lower and lower and lower, and then realize like, actually, that's where I want to be. And it's again because if you do that math, like how many 5-drops do you really want in your limited deck ever? and then you scale that up, you end up with like really only a handful of 5-drops in each color in the whole cube. And so people at the beginning like imagine like, I'll put in all these cards I love, and they end up with a lot of 3, 4, 5-drops, and then maybe a little light on 1s and 2s. But then when you ask them, what do you want your curving your deck to look like? Well, they say, well, I want this many 2-drops, and you scale that up to the cube, and you're like, well, we're actually really short on those. So I haven't looked in detail at the list with regards to curve, and I'm not sure what your expectations are, but that's another place where that kind of very basic math of just scale this deck up to cube size can definitely inform likely cutting a couple of the more sort of fun, ambitious, memorable, top end curves threats for more just bread and butter 2-drops.
I think if anything, we suffer from. I'm worried about the opposite problem. I'm worried about that the curve is pushed to, because we like good cards from limited. You know what I mean? Like we're not. Yeah. We don't have a lot of D+ 5-drops in the list for limited. I mean, and there are some, but I think if anything, like a feeling I had was that I didn't feel like I had to sacrifice much to companion. Like in the practice draft we did, I opened Pack 1 Pick 1 Luris, which is probably the best card in the cube. And I didn't feel like I had to make many concessions because we have so many 1 and 2-drop creatures in the cube.
Well, that's a good place then, maybe. Maybe you're different than the average new cube designer in that way.
Yeah, I think the curve is pretty darn low, which is I think, it should be. I think that's how we want it to play out. But I think I had a similar feeling about, we had Gigantha in there, not to be so all about the companions, but we had Gigantha in there, and I was doing a bunch of like bot drafts with it. And I was like, we don't have enough double pipped stuff in here. Like this card has to go. Like you don't have to make any concession to companion this card.
We're just playing modern now where you get to freak Gigantha forever.
Well, and that's like a reason why Lutri is not in our cube, because like, I don't know, that's just not fun. Like, there's not a restriction there.
Right.
I don't know. I played Lutri in my Golgari deck at our Cube Week, so...
And? How'd it go?
It made 4 squirrels one time. That was cool.
There you go. Yeah. But was free, So, like, yeah. I just... That I think I'm sensitive to that, too. I'm not only worried about things that are too hard to do, I'm also not interested in things being too easy or too powerful. Like, we do want there to be a balance there.
I get the impression these rules of thumb are very helpful. So the one other rule of thumb I'll mention related to like supporting a card that I think it's just kind of inherited wisdom at this point, and you could do the math around it. But I've always been of the opinion that if I have like a card that only works with the presence of some other category of cards, right? Like the dumb examples like Snapcaster Mage, you need to have instants and sorceries. How many instants and sorceries do I need to have in my 40 card deck before I am happy to play a Snapcaster Mage? And I think a good rule of thumb for that sort of baseline is just 7. Like 7 is a good number in a 40 card deck where it's like you will on average have found 1 or 2 in every single game. And so you can trust that your Snapcaster Mage will have targets. So I think that's a good sort of baseline for looking at like supporting cards, with the obvious caveat that like every card requires unique and different types of support, right? We didn't talk too much about Drakehaven, and we actually, I think, should probably move on to talking about Manabase soon, because that's like the last thing we haven't touched on that was one of your sort of big questions. But Drakehaven is a really interesting one in that you don't want to trigger it just once. Like Snapcaster Mage, you only need one spell to flash back, so that's why you only need 7. You're fine if you just have 7 in your deck. Drakehaven, you don't want to just get one Drake out of it. You don't want to pay 3 U for a single 2/2 flyer. That's not a good rate in any environment. So
plus an extra one.
I incorporated it by saying 3U. But thanks YouTube commenter in the flesh. Wow. So you want to trigger it multiple times. So the question is, how many times do you have to trigger it before this is worth it? But that one has the additional added complexity of there are cards that are repeatable discard outlets, right? Like if I just curve Merfolk Looter into Drakehaven, that's incredible. How many Merfolk Looters do I need in my deck before I'm happy with Drakehaven? And Drakehaven is a card I've specifically thought about a lot. It's in one of my cubes, and I'm aiming for like a middling amount of support. I don't want you to be able to just draft a like Pack 1 Pick 1 Drakehaven and then have 14 cyclers or 14 ways to discard. I want you to be able to draft a Drakehaven and have 5 to 6 ways to like cycle and discard a card, plus like 2 to 3 maybe repeatable ones that are like really powerful to combine it with to like make this sort of funny build around. And cards like Drakehaven 2 that are worded such that they work with cycling or just regular discard, I think are really ripe for interesting cube design space, because if you get to combine Drakehaven with like Zombie Infestation, right, which is discard 2 cards, make a 2/2 zombie, that all of a sudden is like, I'm a control deck now where I play removal spells and a Drakehaven and Zombie Infestation and card draw, right? Like that is my whole strategy. I don't even need any other ways necessarily to trigger these cards, because that's just my like play it on turn 7 win condition. It's not even like a thing I'm going to do, kind of incrementally throughout the game. All these cards have such beautiful depth and complexity in terms of like what you want the support for them to look like. And the beautiful thing about Cube is that you get to decide what adequate support is. to come back to the Emery example, Ethan, it may be that the kind of cube that you're describing being happy to take Emery in, where like Artifacts is a deeply supported deck, it may be that if that were in this cube, it would just be way too good. Like maybe having Emery for 1 blue mana on turn 2 every single game, and then having a like menu of things to flashback or to cast from the graveyard with it is just like kind of out of bounds. And so you get to decide if we want Emery to be good here. Like really, I guess you're asking the question of like, is Emery good here? And I guess I would advocate for changing the sort of framing to, do we want Emery to be good here? And if so, let's make it good by adding the amount of support that is appropriate for the other decks in this sort of space, in this sort of context.
And that's what the real difference between Emery and Gearseeker Serpent is, which is that the lines are a little blurrier with Emery. The lines with Gearseeker Serpent do not seem blurry. Like, I think, Anthony, you basically said that when we started talking about those two cards together, where you were like, one is there's a lot more complexity, there's a lot more going on, and the other card is, do you have a lot of artifacts than this card good? You know,
yeah.
Like,
I mean, this is also a big difference in cards that care about creature types. There are some cards that will say like, ETB, if you have an elf, draw a card. You want some number of elves in your deck, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a huge number, versus a card that says all your elves get +1/+1. Now you just want every single elf as much as possible. And I think that first category of types of payoffs ends up giving you a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, I think based on our conversation, you had asked, what's the verdict? I think the verdict is Emery and Gearseeker out is the verdict for me.
That sounds reasonable. I will mention briefly that the other way to balance Gearseeker Serpent, Ethan, just to say the obvious thing, is like, yeah, you add a bunch more artifacts, or you make all your other creatures way worse, right? Which I don't think is on the table for this cube, but those are like the two approaches to like making Gearseeker Serpent good. You either make it good by saying like, actually this being discounted by 2 is above rate for this environment. If you're paying 2 less for this, that's a really good card, or you just like add a bunch of cheap artifacts so you're only paying 2 mana for it, right? But you have to like think about that angle on every card you're balancing, even if in the case of Gearseeker Serpent, it's plainly obvious you're not going to cut all the other creatures and make them all worse so the Gearseeker Serpent can be viable. That is the other sort of angle of it.
We have close to, like, we have between 60 and 70 artifacts in the cube.
And plus a lot of, like, we like a lot of cards that make tokens. Like, there's going to be clues and blood tokens and servos and thopters. Like, we like rectangles in our limited life. So, you know, Gearseeker Serpent could be more supported than it appears at first blush. I don't know.
It also might just be, again, kind of like an Archfiend of Ifnir situation with Anthony, where people see that card and they think like, well, I have to be paying this for like, 2 or 3 mana, otherwise it's not good. Then they get to turn 5 and they're like, actually, this is still a really big threat and the biggest thing on the board. And even though I didn't draft it to play it on turn 5, with barely any discount, turns out it's actually fine here, Like, that can happen sometimes too. We got to talk about mana, because this is going to be a little bit of a rabbit hole too. Talk to me about where you're at with the mana base. You had a question in there about like whether tri-lands were a good choice and, should you get jankier quote than fetches or shocks. Where are each of you feeling right now with the sort of mana base in the cube?
So what I think for listeners' sake, perhaps we'll just say where we're at. So in the 540 cube right now, 75 cards are lands. We have the full cycle of shocks and fetches, and we have the full cycle of surveil lands. We have the half cycle of whatever, the allied colored cycling duels.
Bicycle lands.
Bicycle lands. I haven't heard that. And then we've got the regular fetches plus, I believe, all of the fetch lands from MH3, the ones that can search up one of the 3 basics that they're the color
Which
of.
have cycling for Drakehaven.
Very, very, very good. And then we've got the full cycle of tri-lands. I guess I think I have a philosophical thought, which again, Ben and I haven't talked about this cube really, so I'm airing this for the first time, is that like we are kind of breaking the rules by including fetch lands and shock lands.
I was going to ask about that. I actually didn't know if that was cards that were not in sets that you drafted or if they were in some Modern Horizons set that you were considering to be included.
It depends how wide, like if you want to say like the card had to be first printed in a set we talked about on the podcast, or if it's like it just had to exist, or we could fudge the numbers. I think it's also fine to make concessions because we want people to have good functional mana bases. But I'm also not, I feel like we're pressing up against like vintage cube levels of good mana bases, which I'm not sure that is actually the goal of things. And we've got other things that we can do. There are verges. I even mentioned like, guild gates or like the tapped gain lands that have been like common bread and butter for limited sets over the past few years. Like those aren't showing up. They're significantly worse. And so if you're going to add, like, I don't think we can have an environment where we have like classic fetch lands, shock lands, and then there's also the gain lands or whatever. Like, I think that feels dissonant to me, but I am curious about how we want to calibrate that.
I hadn't really thought that it was breaking the rules. Like, that hadn't occurred to me, but I also don't particularly care that it's breaking the rules. Like, that doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah.
My thought was I want the best mana possible because that gives people the room to cook as much as possible, like to do interesting and unique things with the cube. I think the better your mana is, the more possibilities there are. And I think that is exciting to me, which is why I initially had thought, let's have the best mana possible, but I'm certainly open to that not being the case. Like, it will do different things to the cube. Maybe there's a world where, like, you do the powered version of the vintage cube that has Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation, and you've got, like, maybe we have a version of the cube that's great mana and we have a version of the cube that's less good mana, and we try them both and see what we like the feel of. But I don't have hard thoughts, for sure.
My first thought is that it is very, very common for cubes with some restriction to break that restriction for mana fixing specifically. This happens a lot with Singleton. There's a lot of cubes that play multiple copies of different fixing lands just because they don't want the mana base to be more complicated just, arbitrarily. They're just like, look, this is just mana fixing. Let's break Singleton for it. It's also very common for Peasant and Pauper cubes to play rare mana fixing. That's like another thing that happens a lot is people will play a Pauper cube, but just put better than common lands in there because it's just mana fixing, right? And I think it speaks to your point, Ben, of it just being like, making the mana better is not going to make any specific deck better. It's just going to make everybody's deck better, right? Like, relatively speaking, unless you have like a really deep lands archetype that is going to like benefit a lot more from fetch lands than other decks in like a major way, just making the mana base better on average is just going to make everyone's deck a little more consistent and give them more opportunities to play their spells on curve and potentially splash something, which is a reason I think we see a lot of these restrictions otherwise broken for mana bases, which I would say, like, I think it's totally fine to not have the lands come only from sets you've drafted. I think if you really wanted to commit to the nostalgia factor of like, these are all cards we've actually played with in the sort of sets we talked about in Lords of Limited, I think it would also be fine to like live with that restriction. Maybe at that point, break Singleton if you are like going to harshly restrict yourself to lands that were just in sets that you talked about on the show. I don't think it decreases the sort of vibes or like affects the personality of the cube to have, better mana fixing, for lack of a better word. Now, in terms of the actual mana fixing itself, this is again a topic where there are so many questions to be asked. The first one, which I think we can cover relatively quickly, only because my stances on this are like well documented in an article, is the density of mana fixing. How many mana fixing lands should you have? You're at 75 right now, which I think is an okay number. If, Ben, your goal is like, let's make sure people have good mana, I think you could very easily go much higher and it would not have any negative impacts on the cube. My sort of default rule of thumb for mana fixing, for people that are asking me like, how much mana fixing should I have in my cube? Before they give me any of the information, if they don't tell me about like how many sideboard cards they want to have or what color decks they want to support, my like baseline rule of thumb is 60 at 360, which would be 90 at 540 for just like basic mana fixing lands. And that is substantially less than I run on my own cubes. In my two 360 card cubes, I have the equivalent of 121 lands and 98 lands in my two 360 card like normal cubes. I think it could go a lot higher. And the thing I always ask people to think about here is like, when you get to deck construction, are the deck building decisions you're making interesting? Are you saying like, yes, am I trying to figure out if I want to play this card main deck or make it a sideboard card, or am I trying to dial in my curve exactly right? Or are you getting to deck building and just saying like, all right, well, I've got 28 playables. Let's cut the 4 least good ones. And the least good ones are not like, there's no texture to it. It's just like you had more playables than you needed. And if you're in that second world, which a lot of cubes are, then those 4 picks could have just been lands and your deck would just be better. And these cards that you're not playing because they're just not good enough and they're also not adding any texture to the draft and deck building, they're not really doing a whole lot in the cube to my mind, which is why I usually advocate for people running more fixing lands than they sort of intuitively would by default.
Does that change for us specifically if we're wanting it to feel closer to retail limited? Not that I think we're trying to recreate retail limited, but I think I would not want it to feel like playing. I mean, and I guess we are closer to a vintage cube mana base than not already. Does that change the equation at all for us in your mind?
I think it does. I think it's a question of where you want it to feel like retail limited. If you want it to feel like retail limited when you're looking at packs, then yeah, I would definitely play fewer fixing lands because you're not used to seeing fixing lands in retail limited packs. It's just not a thing that shows up in a high density. And that is genuinely a thing you could optimize for, just making sure that like when you open a pack, it doesn't feel like some foreign thing. It feels like a regular retail limited pack. If you care about it feeling retail limited in the games, I don't think having more fixing is going to make your deck feel less like a retail limited deck. Now, if you like broke singleton on fetch lands and like everybody was fetching on the first 3 turns of the game, like, yeah, that's kind of not the vibe. I feel like for most retail limited games, that becomes like a lot of the time spent shuffling and looking up for your lands like starts to be about the mana, which I don't think is going to affect like how the actual game actions of the game play out. Like, I don't think it's going to mean that, you know, certain decks are way better and you're playing a game plan that is unfamiliar to retail limited, but maybe at that point you're just spending too much time thinking about the mana that it just kind of feels wrong. But in general, I think having much better mana is not going to make it feel any less like retail limited decks when you're actually playing them. It's just going to feel like, oh, it's retail limited decks, but I actually get to curve out instead of being stuck on, you know, waiting for my second color of mana.
Right.
Do the decks get soupy when you have 120 lands?
This is my most controversial opinion in the Cube world, and I will stand by it until the day that I die. I truly do not think that the number of lands in a cube has anywhere near as much impact on how soupy the decks are relative to the other design considerations of the cube. Most importantly, what does aggro look like? Can you punish a deck that's just trying to play the best cards across 4 colors, or is the fastest deck not fast enough to punish that deck and they just get out card valued in the late game? And also, what do the gold cards look like? What is the payoff for taking a bunch of fixing lands and being able to play 4 or 5 colors? Those 2 factors, I think, are much bigger contributors to how soupy a deck feels than the number of fixing lands. The cube I referenced that has 121 fixing lands at 540, which I think it has 85 at 360, which goes up to 121 at 540. That cube, I would say, is absolutely not soupy because it has double shocks and double fetches, which means you're losing a ton of life from your mana base. It has almost no life gain because I hate life gain. And so aggro decks are just very, very good in that cube for mostly those 2 reasons. The curve is also incredibly low. So you need to do something on turn 1 and 2 every single time, every single game. Otherwise, you are falling way behind. And so very, very rarely does anybody draft anything over like 2 and a splash in that cube and have a lot of success with it because of all of his other factors. It's also really important here. I do also think that the nature of the mana fixing more than the quantity is a big impact on this. Because again, that's 121 with double fetches and double shocks. So you can play a 4 or 5 color mana base if you're willing to take 8 or 9 or 10 from your lands by turn 3 or 4, which most decks are not willing to do there. If I was playing original duels instead of shock lands and, you know, I had a set of triomes in there, then yes, I think that exact same cube with the exact same spells would immediately be way more soupy because life totals would just be, you know, 4 to 8 points higher on average in the average game because no one's, you know, putting in shock lands. And triomes specifically, in combination with fetch lands, I think are one of the biggest contributors to that sort of soupiness because cube designers historically love triomes because they're like, oh, this is awesome. I've always wanted there to be another fetchable blue-white land, and I want more fetchable targets so that my like blue-white deck doesn't ever like miss on getting a Hallowed Fountain. It can always get like a fetchable dual land. And when they see a triome, they're like, this is 3 color combinations fetchable dual land. This is great. This is the fetchable dual land for my blue-white deck and my blue-green deck and my blue-green deck. Like all of them can like use this as their dual land. But in reality, when you actually draft a deck with triomes, you often end up being like in pack 3 and just going, oh, actually splashes are free. Like I actually already have this splash. I didn't even prioritize it. I took this because it was a blue-white fetchable for my blue-white control deck, and now my green splash is just totally free, so I'm just going to play these green cards and not think about it that hard. So I think that the nature of the fixing, whether it is going to cost you life, whether it is going to come into play untapped, whether it is going to enable splashes without having to like dedicate picks to having a bigger sort of color suite in your mana base, those are the bigger questions in terms of whether or not you end up with soupy decks, which we haven't even talked about whether or not you want that. You might just say, like, I think it's actually very cool for people to combine limited cards that are like limited bread and butter cards across 3 to 4 colors and like do a new kind of strategy that maybe you haven't otherwise seen. Or you might feel like that's kind of driving sideways over what you had planned for the cube and you want people to be more retail limited style in mostly a color pair, maybe with a splash and not doing anything more ambitious.
I think the way we have the cube currently set up, or at least, and maybe we don't have it set up ideally this way, but in a perfect world, I wouldn't want it to be negatively impacted by the Triomes being in there. Like, I think the cube will be synergistic enough. I don't think it's going to be a 4 and 5 color good cards deck. I think it'll be like 3 to 4 colors. Okay, we're doing these cool synergies together that you couldn't have been doing otherwise with the lands. That would be my hope anyway.
We haven't talked about this, but I do wonder if one of the identities of green in Retail Limited is to enable fixing. And so I wonder if we want like, green to feel like it gets to do that a little bit more. But that's a philosophical question for another day, probably. I am curious about designing a mana base for this cube that does fulfill the restrictions, just as a thought exercise to see what that's like. I think it would be more interesting to me if the mana base wasn't just the mana base we've arbitrarily decided the mana base is basically vintage cube level minus original duels. And I'm not sure if that needs to be the case.
I think it would be an awesome experiment to run. I mean, you have the community that are probably willing to do a couple drafts of each, so you don't have to just like sit around and wonder how it'll feel. You can probably sit down and actually draft a couple times.
Playtesting is the best way to actually get some information and answer these questions. And we can do the napkin math all we want, but really it is about that like actual player experience.
And so is there ever a world also, like thinking about maybe making a paper version of this, that people purposefully don't put the fetches in so that you don't have to deal with shuffling? Is that
absolutely
a thing?
Yeah.
Some people definitely avoid fetch lands for shuffling. Some cube designers avoid shuffling altogether. They just like have no cards in their entire cube that shuffle because they feel like it takes a lot of time. So yeah, people definitely do that. And I think it would be reasonable to have a like separate paper version and digital version of the cube, though I personally would probably be annoyed by that. If I were you, I would just kind of want it to match.
Yeah.
And certainly at 10 fetches at 540, that's not that many shuffles as far as I'm concerned, right? Again, I play 20 plus fetch lands at 360, and that's a lot of shuffling, but I don't think having 10 in a 540 cube is going to like meaningfully add to the length of the matches that is going to like detract from the play of that cube. So
another question that you asked in there was about sort of having different power levels of mana fixing within one mana base, like having a shock land next to a guild gate. And I do agree that like aesthetically that does feel a little bit weird, but having drafted some cubes that do that, it actually does something kind of counterintuitive, which is that those guild gates are going to go much later in the packs, which means if you're really hard up on mana and you really need a little bit of fixing, you're actually kind of more likely to find a little bit of it at a worse quality. So it has this interesting effect of sort of like balancing the mana fixing a little bit better throughout a pot, I've found.
That does also, I think, as long as ETB tap lands are not way behind the power level, like lands that are low picks is another thing that will really encourage the 5-color good stuff deck because you just get them for free. And so you just get a playable card last. You're like, yeah, of course I'll play this. I'm playing all the colors. And so you just get that guild gate that nobody else wanted, which means that you don't even have to prioritize your mana base that much, and you still get a pretty good mana base.
But, I mean, that's where the aggro decks can really, really punish you if you have a slow 5-color deck.
If you're playing 6 guild gates in your deck, then you hopefully are getting smoked by aggro, and then all these things sort of relate to each other and can be balanced. Yeah, I'll say, too, I think one of the cubes you're referencing is my own Sacred Geometry cube, where I run single copies of fetch lands, and then shock lands, surveil lands, and also just the typed enter the battlefield tapped duels. So no upside. They just come into play tap, but it's a, forest island or whatever. And that was because I wanted another fetchable cycle. And I, for this cube, did not want to break singleton and fixing, which I've done on many other cubes. I just wanted to have a different sort of set of restrictions and challenges for myself. I've actually been really happy with that mana base there because, yeah, it means that if you are the blue-red deck and you don't get the higher pick Steam Vents or Thundering Falls, you can get the whatever, I don't know what it's called, the enter the battlefield tapped, red-blue land is much more likely to be something going around later. And I've sort of tried to balance the many color good stuff in that cube with other things. So I do think that those decks can get those cards late, but they're coming to play tapped. Aggro is good, so you can't afford to play 6 tapped lands in your deck and expect to be keeping up with the tempo of the game.
Ben, it looked like you were searching. You were doing some searching on your other monitor.
Yeah, I was just looking at our cube list, and a question. I just have I don't even know if this probably would take way too long to answer, but I assume as cube people, we always have people send us deck lists. I assume you have lots of people send you cube lists and are like, hey, what do you think? Is that an answerable question? Because we haven't give it what do you think of this so far as a first pass?
Praised us. He praised us at the top.
Is it viable? Do you have constructive feedback? Is there overarching stuff you think we haven't thought about or that we missed? Or like where is this at for a first pass? What grade do
I think it's fantastic for a first pass. And again, like Anthony said, playtesting is the most important thing, which we really should have said much sooner because it is actually the only thing that matters. It's actually one of the things I love about Cube is that we can talk about this abstract theory as much as we want, but ultimately it is not anywhere near as like objective or solved as like how many lands do I put in my 40 card deck, or what's the right number of removal spells to run. And so it's really a matter of like what your taste is. And so you should play it a bunch and see if the decks people are drafting look like what you want their decks to look like. And that will tell you so much more than me glancing at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a different experience than drafting a deck, because drafting a deck, you can say like, oh, I expect this to be a 3-0 deck, or I expect this to be an 0-3 because you don't have any of the payoffs you need or whatever. With Cube, your goals are reflect the personality of your podcast and set proper expectations for your players and create a certain kind of gameplay. And those are such different and more abstract and not concrete goals that it's really hard to look at a list and be like, does this accomplish that?
Our honest first feedback, Anthony and I actually talked about this a little bit where we looked at the list, which is like, I looked at it and I was like, that's a lot of cheap creatures that ETB and draw a card or make a token.
Which you said we wanted to put in the cards that we love drafting in Limited, and so it makes sense. It's like you love drafting Priest of Ancient Lore and also Inspiring Overseer and also the 6 other cards that are sort of similar to that.
Which, it can be totally fine. I will say there's a pattern in cubes that include a lot of those cards, which is very often ends up being like Pauper or Peasant cubes that are aiming to like power max will often end up with a ton of those creatures. What I have found and been able to describe my own preferences, having played a bunch of cubes like that, is that I actually don't love playing cubes where the correct strategy feels like to play creatures that are understated for their cost. Ethan said earlier he doesn't want to pay a 3-mana 1/2, but you're playing a lot of 3-mana 2/1s or 2-mana 1/1s, which are like, they're good because it is correct because you're drawing a card and card advantage is great. But I don't find the sort of play patterns that leads to of having a bunch of that to be super fun, because it ends up being these kind of big sprawling board states. And I think aggro actually really struggles in like one of the worst cards you want to see from your opponent if you're an aggro deck is like Fibblethip. You're like, you just played a cantripping removal spell for my one attacker. Like, this is devastating for me. That is the one thing I saw where I was like, I wonder if they're going to end up backing off of that. But I think it makes sense given that those are cards that are, kind of all-stars in their respective limited formats. The question is just, you've never played a limited format where you had this many of them, and I wonder if their density might make you change your relationship to that kind of card.
I did experience that a bit in the playtest games that we did, where I had companioned Luris, and like I knew on like about turn 6 that like there was no way I was losing the game, but it was going to take me a really long time to win the game.
You're like, I have 4 more creatures in play and 4 more cards in my hand than my opponent, but I also only have a like 2 damage a turn clock because I played all of these creatures that have dinky little bodies, but also draw a card or have some other sort of ETB value. So, and I'll be honest, some people adore those kinds of play patterns. They love looking at a big board state and trying to figure out where they can like sneak in a couple damage and like reading something big and complicated like that. For my own preferences, that's a kind of thing that I avoid in my own cube design, but that's why cube design is beautiful. Everyone's got their own different take. I get the impression that these cards were great in their own respective context, but now they're in a new context, and that context is a lot of cards now do this. And so now they're all just trading with each other in combat. And so you're just, okay, we both played a cantripping creature. We blocked each other's cantripping creatures. The game state has not progressed at all. Like, neither of us did anything proactive. We each just replaced our card with another card. And then what did I draw? Another cantripping creature. Off I go to the races,
You said you love rectangles. If this is the rectangle cube, that's totally fine. If I'm drafting it, I'm just going to take Marionette Apprentice very, very highly. And I'm going to enjoy casting a cantripping creature every single turn.
No, that tracks. I think it's worth I think we could probably be a bit more judicious about which ones of those kinds of 3-mana 2/2 that brings a 1/1 or 3-mana 2/1 that draws a card that we want to include.
Yeah, and you probably liked them because in their respective sets, they probably traded with a 2/2 that didn't draw your opponent a card, and now you're up on card advantage. And so like that kind of context, I think, shapes how they like affect games.
Yeah. But I think it's something like Inspiring Overseer. It's not a card that I think Ben or I are particularly fond of. It was like too good in Streets of New Capenna, but it also feels like I feel like there is also a I don't know, B plot goal for the cube.
Is the also history of Limited
to pay homage to the sets that existed in our lifetime of podcasting, and so to not include Inspiring Overseer would feel
it was probably talked about a lot, I imagine, during its run, and so the fact that it was talked about a lot makes it kind of makes sense here, just as like a nod to that chapter.
Whereas like something like Priest of Ancient Lore doesn't really have that.
Sure.
So that could go, that I don't feel as strongly about. So already that feedback is helpful because I'm already like, oh yeah, now that I look at it in that context, like Organ Hoarder has to stay, but other things probably don't.
But genuinely, looking at the list, I was like, this is great, which I hope is a testament to the fact that, like, Ethan, I know you've been listening to the show for a while, and so I think you have at least a sense of our perspective on cubes and have, like, maybe learned from a lot of our experience. And Ben, honestly, it sounds like without having listened to the show for very long, you just naturally have a lot of sort of proclivities that align with what I think is like good for a cube designer. I think you're a natural born cube designer, Ben. Somebody that wants to have 70 archetypes in a cube and just wants cards to be like cool and fun and not work all the time. Like, I think that's a great spot to be. And then, yeah, let the Ethans come and like spike your cube and then learn from them what maybe is a little overtuned. And then you can then maybe take the cards away from Ethan that he's beating your cool stuff with. If Ethan's beating your cool like build arounds with just good bread and butter cards, take some things from him until it's all equal.
It's funny that I am usually I'm the person on our show being like, but this one deck that works 1 in 20 drafts is really cool. And Ben's like, that's stupid. Why are we telling people this? But that we seem to have a reverse approach to how we want to draft this or how we want to design this cube.
What initially sold me on Cube was when they came on, and I mean, you didn't really talk about data, but you were talking about Cube being a new puzzle to solve.
Yeah.
And that is my favorite thing about Magic. Like, when a new set comes out, like, I hate the data because what's fun for me about Magic is solving the puzzle. It's a new puzzle to solve. And then you get the answers to the test. That's horrible. Like, that's no fun at all. And so, like, I was totally sold when you described it as, like, you're creating a puzzle and then you have infinite new puzzles to solve. And so I'm interested to see, like, if we throw a Drakehaven in there, I'm interested to see if Drakehaven will work or not. And then if it doesn't, then we can pull it out and do whatever. I think that's why we've role reversed. Because I just, like, I want to make this big, cool playground and see what works and what doesn't, rather than, like, try to make it work from the get-go.
And then it's just about setting expectations with your drafters and be like, look, this is my huge playground that I have put mild to moderate thought into each inclusion in. Don't expect that every card is going to be 100% supported because I'm just like playing in the space, right? I think you set that expectation, then people should come in and, not be disappointed if a card doesn't work out for them. When I think about a card like Drakehaven in my own cube where I'm trying to support it like a medium amount, what I want is a Drakehaven that if you pack one, pick one and commit, you can make a pretty good Drakehaven deck. And pretty often if it goes in pack 3, no one's even playing it because nobody actually has the density of cards that, it works with. Which means there's also a middle ground if it goes in pack 2 and you had a couple things and now you have like a very medium Drakehaven deck and it's worth including in your deck, but you're not going to like pop off and make 7 Drakes a game. That's just not what your deck is doing. I think a lot of the build-arounds might be in that space, and you should be prepared for, last pick Emrys, because there wasn't actually someone that saw that early and made their draft about that, and that's okay. Last thing I wanted to say, and then we'll let everybody have their last thoughts before we close this extra long episode, is you mentioned specifically in the Power Outliers notes, also wanting to include some cards that were like Power Outliers on the other end, just like cards that were not good enough, but that you have a like sentimentality for or like nostalgia for. I think Durable Coilbug was one of the ones that was referenced. And what I will say about this is that there is a little bit of a trend right now in the cube design world of people making cubes that are like a little jankier and include cards that you literally never want to put in your deck. There's somebody in our local play group that has a Earthshaker in one of his cubes, which is the 8-0 from Future Sight with Trample, that if you have some other way to give it toughness.
Force of Savagery.
Is that what it's called? Force of Savagery? So. Either way, the 8-0 with Trample. He literally has it in the cube because he thinks it's fun to look at, and he likes that everyone passes it, so everyone at the table gets to see it. And I think there's like 2 ways.
And then I passed it, and then the next pack had a way to keep it alive, and I was so bummed.
I think there's like 2 ways in the cube, maybe to like keep it around, or 3. Like basically, you should never do it. Like if you are playing like optimally, you should never, even if you draft all 3 ways to like give it toughness, it's never worth it to like put them both in your deck because you're not going to draw both at the same time. And I actually think this is a really kind of interesting unexplored space where it's like you're going to open 360 cards at the table and you only need 21 cards to make main decks for everybody or 23 cards to make main decks for everybody that are not lands. You've got some lands in there. You absolutely have space for just cards that you fully expect people to never play. And compared to Force of Savagery or whatever, Durable Coilbug is perfectly fine. Someone's going to put that card in their deck when you least expect them to, and they're going to play Emery and mill it over and then cast it next turn, and you're going to be like, okay, that can happen sometimes. So I would encourage you to like not be too ruthless with cards that you have a lot of emotional attachment to, but know are below rate, because I think there's actually a lot of joy, especially in the fact that this cube is also serving as a artifact of the podcast and your relationship with Limited. I think there's a lot of joy in just having a couple cards in there that, people just look at and put in their sideboard. I think that's fine.
And I mean, it's not even, Durable Coil Bug fits in terms of,
Insidious Roots, baby. People are going to be popping off.
I hope so. I know I will be. Yeah. I'm excited for that. I think our discussion had already informed an answer to that question, but I'm glad to have heard it concretely.
My last question for you is, I just listened to your episode on resonance, and I would like to know if we're allowed to call this the Lords of Limited Cube, or if we need to think of a name that doesn't include the word cube.
I think it's totally fine for this context because it is the cube for when it makes sense. I think to use cube in the title is when you are specifically referencing a existing IP, and I hate intellectual property. I hate to refer to Lords of Limited as IP.
Not say that.
Well, I don't want to say thing, but Lords of Limited is a concrete idea, and so to have here's an existing concrete idea people have associations with cube, I think that's fine. I think it's not great when you are trying to invent a new idea and then you're just calling it the new idea cube, but no one knows what that first word means anyway, and so it's you didn't do anything by adding cube to this because no one has any associations with that first thing. So I think Lords of Limited Cube is totally fine for the name of this cube and perfectly resonant.
Let's go.
Great.
We got to wrap it up there. Otherwise, Matthew, our lovely editor, is going to rip my head off for getting him such a long episode. But this was a fantastic conversation. I am so excited to follow this cube as it evolves. And I'm really excited to hear the lessons that you all learn from curating it. And selfishly, I hope you have a couple more episodes of your show where you just talk about this cube and, are maybe over the current Limited set. And you're like, you know what? Let's just have an episode where we do a check-in and talk about how the cube has evolved and where we're going with it.
It was just quite fortuitous. After we recorded your guest spot on our show, Andy, you were like, "Oh, why would have you? We'd love to have you on, but in what context?" I was like, "I don't think it's going to happen." And then
it happened. But this is the arc that I've seen so many Magic players go through, and that I've gone through myself. That just cube is such a wonderful, flexible space that you can be sort of spiky, but you also get to be really creative. So it's not surprising that people are falling into it, and I'm really excited to watch this journey for you guys as well.
Yeah, I genuinely believe that cube is just the best way to play Magic, as I'm sure you all know. So I think more people, if they thought about it in the terms that you have now started to think about it, would be like, yeah, of course we want to do that. It lets us be everything. It's everything. It lets us be the spiky Limited players who are trying to figure out this puzzle, and it also lets us be creative and decide what that puzzle should be. So you're not at the whims of whatever PAX Wizards of the Coast is currently trying to sell.
Yeah, I've spent more time on Cube Cobra in the last week than I have a new website ever in my entire life. I think also because the vintage cube or the powered cube's coming to Arena, and I knew on Cube Cobra as a result of your episode about cube curation tools, I could compare that with the current MTGO vintage cube. I do have a quick question about Cube Cobra, and then I swear we'll go. Can we make it show only artifacts, or can we make it show only enchantments?
If you use the Scryfall search syntax, so it would be T:artifact. And I wrote a whole article on
No. But in Cube Cobra.
Yes, correct.
There's a filter button on the view list.
Okay.
That supports basically all of Scryfall's syntax. Not quite everything. It doesn't have regular expressions, but it has all of the basic Scryfall syntax. So you can hit filter and then filter the list by whatever you want.
So we could say is:artifact, and it would display all the artifacts in the cube.
I don't know if is.
I don't think you need is.
T:artifact works.
Or T:artifact.
Okay.
And you can chain them together and combine them however you want.
Okay.
And O: to search the full rules text.
Awesome.
And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Ben and Ethan, this was a true delight, and I could not be more happy to welcome two great new minds to the Cube space. And, my wish for you is that fast forward 3 years and Lords of Limited is just another Cube podcast. And that's all you're doing because it is the best way to play Magic.
Cheers to that.
From your lips to our lips, I guess.
The classic lip-to-lip exchange. All the music for the show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is graciously edited by Matthew. Thank you, Matthew, for editing this extra long episode. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and this podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and speaking to microphones about it. Anthony, Ben, and Ethan, thank you all for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for being on and joining the best format.
Truly our pleasure.
Thanks for having us. Glad to be at the bottom of the pyramid scheme.
A nice sturdy base.
It'll be a brief
sturdy
time
base
before you recruit the new base.
Yeah, then you'll get 3 friends, and they'll get 3 friends. Yeah,
you may even get 300 friends. You know, you got the podcast.
I'm gonna have that pink Mary Kay convertible before you know it.
The pink cube box.